The moment my ex-husband slid the platinum card across the marble counter, he was still smiling. "Charge everything that remains to this account," Julian Cross said, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual command he'd perfected over the years, the one that suggested money was merely an afterthought, a minor administrative detail in the grand theater of his existence. He was an alpha in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside when he walked through a room. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit custom-made, his cufflinks engraved with the initials of his company. Everything about him screamed success. Beside him, his new mate, Evan Marchetti, was still wearing his wedding suit. The diamond cufflinks at his wrists caught the light from the chandeliers, and the pale gold collar around his throat, the ceremonial mark of an Omega who had married up, gleamed with an almost obscene brightness. Evan was younger than Julian by 3 years, 26 to Julian's 29, with sharp, delicate features and the kind of carefully cultivated beauty that made people underestimate him at their own peril. His Omega scent, normally a sweet blend of roses and honey, was intensified tonight by excitement and triumph. Only minutes earlier, Evan had held that same platinum card up for photographs, laughing as he told everyone that his family's investment connections had secured it through the private client division of the Meridian Hotel Group. He'd waved it at the camera like a trophy, his gold collar catching the flash, his smile wide and radiant. "It's a founder's legacy account card," he'd announced to anyone who would listen. "My uncle arranged it through the board." According to Evan, it meant they didn't have to stand at a front desk like ordinary guests. They didn't have to worry about credit limits, deposits, or anyone questioning what they could afford. He'd even smiled at the banquet manager and said, with that particular condescension that Omegas sometimes use to assert themselves in alpha-dominated spaces, "At the Meridian Grand, the price is never the important part. What matters is who is willing to open the door for you." Julian had loved that line. He'd repeated versions of it all night. First during the cocktail hour, when he'd been showing off to a cluster of potential investors. Again during his toast, when he'd raised his glass and spoken about partners who elevate each other. And once more when a reporter from a business magazine had asked how he'd managed to secure the hotel's most exclusive rooftop space on such short notice. Each time, he'd touched the platinum card in his pocket, a gesture so habitual now that he probably didn't even realize he was doing it. His alpha scent, whiskey and tobacco, warm and possessive, had been thick with satisfaction all evening. The wedding had originally been planned for 80 guests. By dinner, the number had grown to 140. The standard champagne had been replaced with bottles from the hotel's private cellar, vintages that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The floral team had worked through the night to build a suspended garden above the dance floor, thousands of white orchids and trailing ivy that made the ballroom feel like an enchanted forest. Julian had reserved the rooftop lounge for an after-party that hadn't been included in the original contract, and he'd added a midnight dessert bar, a cigar lounge, and a private Omega relaxation suite for Evan's wedding party. There was even a champagne tower, 72 crystal flutes stacked in a pyramid, each one filled with a different vintage, each one representing another $1,000 Evan had insisted they needed to impress the investors. Each time they added something, the hotel printed a supplemental agreement with the exact price. Each time, Julian signed without reading more than the first line. He'd developed a signature for these occasions, flourishing, confident, the kind of signature that said I sign things because I can afford them. Someone on his team, probably his long-suffering business manager, a beta named Marcus who had been with him since the early days, had warned him that the last-minute additions alone had already passed $75,000. Julian had lifted the platinum card between 2 fingers, waved it lazily, and smiled. "It'll go to the private account. The hotel knows who we are. We've been using this card for years." And that was true. For the past 3 years, that card had been his key to every locked door, his passport to every room that required connections, his proof to every client and competitor that Julian Cross had arrived. He'd built his reputation on it, and Evan had polished that reputation into something even more dazzling. Together, they'd constructed a narrative of success that had fooled almost everyone, including, most importantly, themselves. But when the billing clerk placed the card on the reader, a red message appeared on the screen. Authorization revoked. Julian's smile froze. His alpha scent, which had been so confident all evening, suddenly curdled with confusion. Run it again. The clerk tried a second terminal. The result did not change. Evan stepped forward so quickly that the train of his wedding suit caught beneath his heel. His omega scent, warm and honeyed all evening, suddenly sharpened with alarm. You selected the wrong account, he said, his voice rising. That's a founder's legacy level card. My family's investment partners. The banquet manager checked the card number, then looked back at them with the same professional, unreadable expression he'd worn all evening. He was a beta in his 50s, the kind of man who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. The card is genuine, and Mr. Cross was once an authorized user. However, it is an additional card attached to a private family house account. The primary account holder revoked his authorization 4 months ago. 4 months ago. Julian turned sharply toward Evan. 4 months ago was the day after. The day after your divorce became final. The manager continued smoothly. The corporate American Express card listed as the event's payment guarantee has also been charged, the clerk added quietly. The bank has declined the transaction because, he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, because there is not enough available credit. Then the printer began producing the final invoice. The sound of it was obscenely loud in the sudden silence. That rhythmic click and hum of paper feeding through the machine, the software of the thermal transfer. Everyone in the vicinity seemed to hold their breath. $15,000 remained from the original wedding package. The services added that day came to $78,620. The total amount still due was $93,620. Guests who had not yet left the ballroom slowly stopped talking. Conversations faltered. The champagne flutes in their hands suddenly seemed less like celebration and more like awkward props. Several people who had been hovering near the bar drifted closer to the billing counter, not quite crowding, but definitely listening. A few had their phones out, not even pretending to be discreet anymore. The whole scene was rapidly becoming the kind of spectacle that would make its way onto social media within the hour. Julian stared at Evan. You told me your family's investment group arranged this card for me. You told me your uncle. The color drained from Evan's face. Beneath his carefully applied makeup, his omega features had gone pale, his scent shifting from honeyed warmth to something sharper, more acrid. Fear. The unmistakable omega scent of fear, the kind that could trigger protective instincts in alphas, or, in this particular case, the opposite. The banquet manager hesitated before saying, "This card has never been connected to Mr. Marchetti or any member of his family. It belongs to the private house account of the Ashworth family, one of the Meridian Group's founding families." Julian looked as though he had not understood the words. His alpha scent was sour with bewilderment. Who authorized the main account? The manager turned toward me. Mr. Sebastian Ashworth. That was my name. It was also the name of the Omega ex-husband Julian had mocked in his wedding speech less than an hour earlier. The Omega who, according to him, had only wanted a safe little life and had never understood ambition. The Omega who had been too ordinary to keep someone like Julian Cross interested. The Omega who had apparently been so dull and predictable that Julian had found it necessary to upgrade to a younger, more ambitious Omega with a better understanding of the alpha world. I had been standing in the doorway to the private billing office for approximately 4 minutes. I'd come down from the 28th floor, where I'd been chairing a brand committee meeting, but I hadn't rushed. I'd finished my presentation first, answered questions about the upcoming portfolio expansion, reviewed the quarterly projections, and only then excused myself to handle a private matter. I was an Omega, but I was also an Ashworth, and I had learned long ago that the two things were not mutually exclusive. When the elevator doors opened and I saw Julian slamming that card against the marble counter, I felt something very strange. Nothing at all. No anger. No satisfaction. No lingering hurt. Just a vast, empty peace, like the silence after a storm has finally passed. My own scent, sandalwood and white tea, clean and cool, remained perfectly steady. I had spent years learning to control my omega reactions, to never let my scent betray what I was feeling. Tonight, that control was effortless. Julian hadn't noticed me yet. He was too focused on the clerk, on Evan, on the disaster unfolding in front of him. But I could see the moment the general manager's eyes found mine, the slight nod he gave me. Professional, discreet, exactly the kind of communication that had been happening in the background of Julian's life for years without him ever knowing. The manager was a beta, neutral and calm, and he had been one of my most trusted allies in the family's business for over a decade. The first time I met Julian Cross, I was 24 and he was 23. I'd just finished my MBA at a prestigious university, and I was still figuring out who I was outside of my family's shadow. As an Omega, I had been raised to be discreet, to manage the family's interests quietly, to let the alphas take the public roles while I worked behind the scenes. But I had always known I was more than just a pretty Omega to be married off for alliances. I had a brain, and I intended to use it. Julian was the first person who looked at me and saw Sebastian, not Sebastian Ashworth, heir to one of the most powerful hotel families in North America, and certainly not just an Omega who should be content with a quiet life. He didn't care about my last name. He barely asked about my family at all. What he saw was a man who could stand beside him, who could support him, who could be his partner. We met at an entrepreneurship conference. Julian had just opened his corporate consulting firm with nothing but a laptop, a terrifying amount of student debt, and the kind of relentless, burning ambition that I found almost hypnotic. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. His alpha scent was sharp with nerves and determination, and he was waiting outside a meeting room for 3 hours just to catch a 5-minute conversation with a prospective client. Most alphas I knew would have demanded access, pulled rank, used their status to push through. Julian just waited. Patiently. Determinedly. I watched him from across the hallway, and I was fascinated. When the client finally appeared, Julian didn't complain. He didn't beg. He gave a clear, concise pitch, shook the man's hand, and walked away with nothing but a promise to follow up. Later that evening, I found him at the hotel bar, nursing a single whiskey he'd probably stretched for an hour. His alpha scent was muted, tired but not defeated. "Hard day?" I asked. He looked up, and I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the fire. The refusal to give up. "Hard year," he said, "but I'm still standing." We talked for 3 hours. He told me about his firm, his plans, his dreams. I told him about my family's investments in hospitality, though I kept the details vague. He asked if I worked in the industry, and I said I was consulting for a few luxury brands. "Family money?" he asked, and when I hesitated, he laughed. "It's fine. I don't care about that. I care about what you do, not what you have." Besides, he leaned in, his alpha presence warm and unthreatening. "You're an Omega who's not trying to impress me with your family connections. That's refreshing." "I care about you," he'd said, early in our courtship, when I tried to explain that my family had been in the hotel business for generations. "I don't care what your family owns. I want you to be my partner, not someone else's legacy." At the time, it had sounded romantic. Later, I learned there is a difference between not caring about someone's money and not caring enough to know them. We started dating. I fell hard. Julian was everything I wasn't supposed to want as an Omega. Confident, aggressive, hungry for success in a way that I'd never been allowed to be in public. My family had raised me to be discreet, to build wealth quietly, to let the professional executives run the companies while the Ashworths sat in the background. As an Omega, I was expected to be the invisible hand, not the visible face. Julian, by contrast, wanted to be the visible face. He wanted the world to see what he'd built. And when he looked at me with those sharp, clever eyes, I felt like maybe he could build something with me, not despite my being an Omega, but because I would never compete with him for the spotlight. I would be his support, his partner, his anchor. We didn't have a large wedding. Julian was trying to land his first major client and refused to spend money he didn't have. He also didn't want anyone assuming he had married me for connections. Or, more accurately, he didn't want to feel like he had. So we signed the papers at City Hall, had dinner with fewer than 20 relatives and friends, and spent our wedding night in a modest hotel room that Julian had paid for himself. He was so proud of that. You see, he'd said, pulling me close, his alpha scent warm and possessive around me. His temporary marking bite on my neck was fresh, a claiming that was supposed to bond us together. We're building this together. Just us. No one else. This is our life, Sebastian. Our success. I'd believed him. I'd wanted to believe him. I was an Omega, supposedly the weaker of the secondary genders, supposedly meant to be protected, provided for, controlled. But I also wanted to be loved. I wanted to be seen as something other than the heir to a fortune I hadn't earned, or the Omega who should be grateful for any alpha's attention. Julian offered me that. He offered me a life where I could be just Sebastian, a man who loved another man, who had made his own way. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I had felt like I was living in a dream. We worked hard. We played hard. We built a life that felt like ours. Julian's firm started to grow. He landed bigger clients, secured bigger contracts, started to make a name for himself. And I was there, in the background, supporting him, loving him, believing that we were partners in every way that mattered. But the dream had cracks. I could see them now, looking back. The way Julian's eyes would slide past me when I tried to discuss my work. The way he'd dismiss my suggestions with a casual, "That's not really how it works in my world." The way he'd never quite asked what I did during the day, or who I met with, or what I was building. The way he assumed, as an alpha, that an Omega's world was always smaller than his. Julian's business grew, but so did his need to be the architect of everything. Every success, every opportunity, every favor extended, it all had to come from him, or it didn't count. When I offered to help, to use my connections, to make introductions, he would smile and say, "Thank you, but I want to do this myself. I want to prove that I can make it on my own. I don't want people saying my Omega got me where I am." I admired that. I really did. I thought it was noble. I thought it was the mark of an alpha who would never be beholden to anyone, who would always stand on his own 2 feet. I didn't realize it was the beginning of a wall he was building between us. The real trouble started 3 years into our marriage, when Julian was preparing for a presentation that could change everything for his firm. A major client wanted the final proposal and signing dinner held at the Meridian Grand Chicago, our flagship property, the crown jewel of the family's portfolio. The conference rooms were booked months in advance. Corporate events required payment guarantees and credit card pre-authorizations. Julian called for days and couldn't secure the right date. I offered to help. He rejected me immediately. "Sebastian, this is company business. Your mother's hospitality connections are lovely, but they're not in the same category as Meridian." I reminded him that I had told him my family invested in hotels. He sighed as if I were embarrassing both of us. I know, but this client specifically wants Meridian. Don't try to prove you have connections and end up making me look desperate. I don't want anyone thinking my Omega had to pull strings for me. I stopped arguing. At that point, Julian was sleeping 4 hours a night, running on coffee and adrenaline and the sheer force of his determination. I didn't want the most important presentation of his career to turn into another fight about whether accepting help from his Omega husband made him less successful. So the next morning, I contacted Meridian's private client office. I asked them to create a Founder's Legacy account card in Julian's name. It wasn't a credit card. It didn't make anything free. It was an authorization card linked to my family's private house account. An approved user could skip the usual hotel deposit and bank card pre-authorization. Instead, the user signed the charges to the main account. At the end of each month, Meridian sent the signed invoices to the account holder for review and payment. Only the authorized user's name appeared on the card. The sponsor's identity remained private. That rule protected family account holders from public exposure. As an Omega, I had learned that privacy was power. I didn't need the world to know what I controlled. I just needed to control it. I applied for the card because I didn't want Julian struggling with credit limits and payment procedures in front of an important client. To control the risk, I placed a $100,000 annual limit on his authorization. Every charge required Julian's signature. I also added a note to the file: preferred treatment for all reservations. Priority booking. Complimentary upgrades when available. Do not mention the sponsor's identity. The card arrived at his office on a day that happened to be the same day Evan Marchetti started his job as Julian's client relations manager. Evan was young, Omega, beautiful in that sharp-edged way that made people underestimate him. He was the kind of Omega who knew how to use his secondary gender, how to smile just right, how to scent just sweet enough, how to make alphas feel powerful and protective. He accepted the delivery, opened the package, and, as I would later learn, saw the letter explaining that the card belonged to a private primary account, and that all signed charges would ultimately be paid by the account sponsor. Evan did not give Julian that letter. Instead, he placed the card in a new gift box, wrapped it in expensive paper, carried it into Julian's office himself, and told him that he had an uncle in the hotel's private client division. According to Evan, the man had used his influence to secure the card in the conference room. He spun a story about family connections, about an uncle who owed him favors, about how us Omegas have to look out for each other in this alpha world. Julian never called the hotel to verify the story. That evening, he came home excited and showed me the card. Evan keeps his connections quiet, he said. But when it matters, he gets things done. He's not like other Omegas. He understands how the alpha world works. I stared at him. He told you he arranged that card? Of course. He even knew which conference room I needed. His uncle is apparently very high up at Meridian. Julian, maybe you should read the original letter. Or ask the hotel who the main account belongs to. He frowned. He just solved a major problem for my company, and you're determined to be suspicious of him? Sebastian, not everything is about you. Just because you're an Omega doesn't mean every other Omega is competition. I looked at the card in his hand and stayed silent for several seconds. I could have opened my laptop and shown him the authorization request. I could have put the account records in front of him that night. But the presentation was 3 days away. I didn't want him to turn the truth into a story about a jealous husband trying to steal credit from a capable employee. I didn't want to be the hysterical Omega who couldn't handle another Omega being praised. I told myself I would explain after the contract was signed. The proposal went perfectly. The client loved the room, the dinner, the service. Julian's firm won the largest contract it had ever received. At the celebration, he thanked Evan in front of the entire company. He said Evan's relationships had given the business an opportunity it could never have earned on its own. He praised Evan's rare ambition as an Omega, his willingness to play the game at a level most Omegas couldn't reach. I sat at the edge of the room, watching Julian raise his glass to the man who had stolen my card, and I suddenly didn't know when the truth could be introduced without sounding like an accusation. The celebration was too joyous, too triumphant. Any revelation would have seemed petty, jealous, small. Exactly the stereotype of an Omega that I had spent my whole life fighting. I brought up the card again after the project ended. Julian was preparing for a new round of client meetings, barely looking away from his phone. Evan handled the paperwork, he said. You don't need to worry about it. It's a business matter. I let the subject drop. It became one of the worst choices I made during our marriage. I thought refusing to claim credit was kindness. I didn't understand that silence gives a lie room to grow roots. I didn't understand that as an Omega, my silence would be interpreted not as generosity, but as submissiveness, as weakness. For the next 3 years, Julian used that card to reserve meeting rooms, client suites, dinners, and private receptions. Once Meridian's system recognized the founder's legacy account authorization, it automatically provided a private concierge, room priority, and detailed guest preference service. Evan didn't need to know a single senior executive. All he had to do was call, give Julian's name, and the hotel prepared everything according to the account level. He would say my uncle's office arranged this, and the hotel staff, trained to be discreet, would never contradict him. He took services built into my card and presented them as proof of his influence. Julian gradually came to believe Evan was the person responsible for his success. When friends praised me for supporting him through the early years, Julian would smile and say, "Sebastian prefers a quiet life. The business world isn't really his world. He's more comfortable at home." When clients asked how he always secured Meridian's best rooms, he would answer with false modesty. "Stay in business long enough, and you develop a few private relationships. Evan is very good at maintaining those for me." The invoices for those rooms and dinners arrived in my private account every month. Over 3 years, they totaled more than $200,000. Most were legitimate client events and company expenses. I treated them as my contribution to our marriage and to Julian's growing firm. I never asked him to repay me. I believed spouses didn't need to turn every act of support into a debt. I believed, naively, that Julian would eventually see the truth. Julian took my silence as proof that I had contributed nothing. He began treating me like a decorative omega, someone to be displayed at events but not consulted on decisions. He stopped asking my opinion. He stopped telling me about his day. He came home later and later, always with an excuse about client dinners, about networking, about the endless demands of building a business. The first time I noticed something was wrong was at a charity gala, maybe 18 months into the card's existence. Julian had been invited as a rising young entrepreneur, a profile he'd cultivated carefully, and I was accompanying him as his Omega husband. Evan was there too, of course. He was always there now, hovering at the edges of Julian's orbit, his Omega scent carefully calibrated to be pleasant and unthreatening. But that night, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, Evan's hand on Julian's arm, lingering a beat too long. The way Julian leaned into him when they laughed together. The way they seemed to have their own private conversation happening beneath the surface of the public one. The way Evan's Omega scent would spike slightly whenever Julian paid attention to someone else. Possessive, territorial, the kind of subtle chemical signal that most people wouldn't notice but that I, as an Omega attuned to these things, definitely did. I told myself I was being paranoid. Julian loved me. We'd built a life together. I was his Omega, his mate, the one he'd chosen. But the paranoia didn't go away. It grew, quiet and insidious, taking root in the spaces between my certainty. Julian began coming home later. His alpha scent, when he finally crawled into bed, was wrong. Not infidelity exactly, not yet, but something else. Excitement. Anticipation. The kind of chemical signature that used to be reserved for me. The temporary marking bite he'd placed on my neck 3 years ago was fading, and he didn't seem interested in renewing it. When I asked where he'd been, he told me I didn't understand the pressure of building a business. He suggested I leave my brand consulting job. "Your income doesn't make much difference," he said. "Taking care of our home would help me more. Omegas are better at that anyway." What he didn't know was that I had already begun representing my family on Meridian's brand committee. I had no public title and no profile on the corporate website. But the projects under my supervision had budgets larger than his company's annual revenue. I still didn't tell him. Not because I was testing him. Every time I tried to discuss my work, he redirected the conversation to his own achievements within minutes. He didn't want to hear about my day. He wanted me to admire his. He wanted me to be the audience for his success, not a partner in it. He wanted a traditional Omega, and I had never been that. 1 year before our divorce, I found an unusual charge on the monthly Meridian statement. 3 nights in a Riverview honeymoon suite at the Meridian, New York. The extras included a dinner for 2, a couple's spa treatment, and an engraved bottle of champagne. The note on the reservation read, "Happy 3rd anniversary to us." Julian had told me he was in Seattle meeting a client. As the primary account holder, I had the right to review every signed invoice. I asked private client services for the electronic records. Julian had signed the charges. The second guest listed in the suite was Evan Marchetti. Their third anniversary as a couple had fallen during the third year of our marriage. That meant their affair had begun soon after Evan intercepted the platinum card. While I had been paying for Julian's client dinners and business meetings, I had also been paying for his dates with another Omega. For the hotel rooms where he was being unfaithful. For the champagne they toasted their secret relationship with. The most humiliating part was that I had paid for their anniversary celebration. The spa treatments, the champagne, the romantic dinner. All of it had been charged to my family's account, signed by Julian, billed to me, paid by me. I had unknowingly financed my own betrayal. I printed the invoice and placed it on the dining table. Julian came home that night, saw it, and his face changed immediately. But he didn't apologize. His first question was, "Why are you checking my hotel records?" "Because the bill was sent to me." He stared for a second, then gave a cold laugh. "Did you hire someone to investigate me, Sebastian? When did you become this controlling? This is why I can't stand being around you. Always checking up on me like a suspicious little Omega." I asked how long he'd been with Evan. After a short silence, he admitted it. He said Evan understood his ambition. Evan could accompany him to client dinners without being too quiet. Evan could open doors at Meridian. Evan could help him become the man he was supposed to be. I, according to him, wanted an ordinary life. I wasn't ambitious enough. I couldn't keep up. I was just another traditional Omega who wanted a safe little existence. "Evan got me that platinum card when I needed it most," he said. "He makes sure the hotel remembers every detail for my clients. He has connections. He knows how to play the game." Then he looked at me with something close to pity. "What have you ever done for my business, besides complain that I come home late and check my credit card bills?" I wanted to tell him the card was mine. I wanted to tell him that the hotel group he treated as unreachable was held by my family. I wanted to explain that every door he'd walked through, every room he'd reserved, every privilege he'd enjoyed, it had all come from me, and I had given it freely because I loved him. But before I spoke, I understood something that changed the way I saw our entire marriage. Julian had not betrayed me because he lacked information. He had chosen to look down on me first. He had looked down on me because I was an Omega, and he had decided that an Omega could never be his equal. After that, he accepted any explanation that supported the story he wanted to believe. He wanted to believe Evan had gotten him the card because that made Evan valuable, a useful Omega who understood the alpha world. He wanted to believe I was ordinary because that made his success more impressive. He wanted to believe he had built everything himself because that made him feel powerful. If I proved my identity that night, his first regret would not be hurting me. He would regret losing access to a more valuable resource. He would feel embarrassed, not sorry. He would see me as a source he'd failed to exploit properly. He would never see me as a partner. I didn't need family shares to convince my alpha husband that I deserved respect. So I asked only, "Have you made your decision?" Julian didn't hesitate. "I want a divorce. Evan is a better match for me. He understands what I need." The next day, I instructed my attorney to prepare the papers. We had no children, and our shared property was simple to divide. I didn't demand repayment for the hotel expenses paid during the marriage. I had approved them while I still considered him my husband. I didn't want to prolong the fight. I wanted out. But at 9:12 a.m., the morning after our divorce became final, I sent written instructions to Meridian Private Client Services. Julian Cross was to be removed from every Ashworth family account. It wasn't revenge. Any private account removes additional users when a marriage, employment relationship, or other authorization ends. I had no obligation to finance my ex-husband's hotel expenses. I had no obligation to continue supporting the man who had discarded me for a prettier, more ambitious Omega. I assumed he would discover the revoked card within days. Instead, for months passed without him using it once. Evan had spent years protecting the myth of his influence. He told Julian that Founders Legacy cards shouldn't be used too frequently, or they might trigger an internal review. He also believed the card was a permanent business privilege awarded to Julian and his firm. He had no idea that the sponsor had been an Omega, and not just any Omega, but the one he'd replaced. The original letter only said that a private account sponsor stood behind the charges. It didn't identify me. It also stated that the sponsor could withdraw authorization at any time. But for 3 years, the main account had never rejected a charge bearing Julian's signature. Evan decided the unknown sponsor must value Julian's commercial importance, not his marriage. He assumed the sponsor was an alpha, some powerful businessman who wanted Julian's company as a partner. As long as the physical card still carried Julian's name, Evan assumed the privilege remained active. Julian believed him. When they decided to mate, Evan suggested the Meridian Grand Chicago. He needed an expensive wedding to change the way people saw him. He didn't want to be remembered as the Omega employee who had destroyed his alpha boss's marriage. He wanted to appear as the sophisticated partner who had elevated Julian into a more powerful circle. He wanted the gold collar around his throat to mean something. Julian needed the wedding for his own reasons. After our divorce, some long-term clients had quietly questioned the way he discarded the Omega who had been beside him while he built his company. He wanted to prove that leaving me had cost him nothing. In his version of the story, Evan was more valuable, more connected, and more suited to the successful life he now deserved. He wanted everyone to see that he had upgraded. The wedding team treated them like ordinary clients and issued an ordinary contract. The original budget was $110,000. Julian paid a $40,000 deposit when they signed. 1 week before the wedding, he paid another $50,000 as required. The remaining $15,000, along with any same-day additions, would be settled after the event. He also provided a verified corporate American Express card as the payment guarantee. Evan tried to use the founder's legacy account card in place of the deposit and advance payment. The sales manager explained that the private account card could only be presented after the event to request that the remaining balance and approved additions be transferred to the primary account. It couldn't replace the contract deposit, advance payment, or backup credit card. The manager also explained that all charges depended on active authorization on the date of settlement. Those terms appeared in writing in the contract. Evan didn't want Julian to realize he didn't understand the card he claimed to have arranged. So he told Julian the advance payments were merely standard procedure. After the wedding, he said, his uncle would arrange internal credits and refunds. We Omegas have to know how to work the system, he'd said, with a conspiratorial smile. Julian paid $95,000 from the company's account. He believed Evan's imaginary uncle would reduce or absorb the remaining $15,000 and any last-minute charges. Evan believed Julian had just completed a major funding round and could easily pay, even if the hotel refused. Julian never told Evan the financing existed only as a non-binding letter of intent. His office was leased. His luxury car belonged to a corporate rental program. The cash in his business account was already needed for salaries and suppliers. He was living on credit, on appearances, on the carefully constructed image of success that had become more important to him than actual success. He was an alpha who couldn't admit he was failing. Evan never told Julian that his hotel executive uncle did not exist. He'd been bluffing from the beginning, and the bluff had worked so well that he'd started to believe his own lies. He'd convinced himself that his charm, his beauty, his Omega cleverness had made everything possible. Each of them was waiting for the other person's invented identity to pay the bill. On their wedding day, they pushed that misunderstanding beyond the point where either could escape. Julian invited almost every client and prospective investor he considered important. During the reception, he placed the platinum card on the bar where people could see the founder's legacy emblem. A guest asked how he'd obtained one. Julian didn't mention Evan. He certainly didn't mention me. He only smiled. Meridian makes special arrangements for long-term partners. You just need to know who to talk to. During his speech, he referred to me without using my name. I spent years trying to make an Omega who wanted a safe, quiet life understand my ambition, who wanted to stay home, who never had any drive. Then he took Evan's hand. Eventually, I met an Omega willing to stand at my level. capable of opening doors beside me. Ambitious. Smart. The kind of Omega who helps an alpha reach his full potential. The guests applauded. Evan looked beautiful in the spotlight, his Omega grace on full display, his gold collar gleaming, his sense sweet and triumphant. I could see the victory in his eyes, the victory of having won, of having taken everything from me and made it his. Evan looked at the clients and investors in the ballroom and became even more determined that the wedding must appear flawless. He decided the flowers at the entrance didn't look dramatic enough in photographs. He demanded that the design be replaced with a suspended garden. The floral company quoted $17,000, plus an overnight rush fee. Julian had just implied in front of several clients that his company's revenue had doubled. He couldn't admit that the additional cost made him uncomfortable. He signed. Later, Evan overheard guests describing the wine list as ordinary. He ordered bottles from Meridian's reserve cellar instead. The banquet manager told them clearly that the upgrade would cost more than $23,000. Julian hesitated. Evan leaned close and whispered, his Omega sense sweet and persuasive. My uncle will get us the internal rate when they close the account. All your clients are here. You can't let them think the company is short on cash. You're an alpha. You can't look weak in front of them. Julian signed again. More clients arrived without confirmed seats. Evan's relatives wanted rooms for the night. One of Julian's partners suggested continuing the celebration in the rooftop lounge. Additional tables, 16 guest rooms, the lounge rental, late-night food, and extra security were added one by one. Every time, the hotel printed the price on a supplemental agreement. Every time, Julian signed his name. He watched Evan remain calm and assumed he could erase most of the charges. Evan watched Julian sign without hesitation and became more convinced that millions of dollars were sitting in his business account. They encouraged each other's performance while lying to each other. After the last important client left, Julian finally placed the platinum card on the billing counter. Authorization revoked. Primary account declined transfer. Backup credit card declined by the bank. The fantasy they had maintained for 4 months collapsed in seconds. Standing in front of me at the counter, Julian still struggled to accept the truth. He picked up the card. You gave me this? Yes. When? Before your first client presentation at Meridian. 3 years ago. 3 years, he turned to Evan. You told me. There is no person matching Evan's story in the board, the executive team, or private client services, the general manager interjected. We checked. Thoroughly. No uncle. No connections. Nothing. Evan raised his voice. You're lying. I was the one who got that card. I was the one. I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. The general manager suggested continuing the dispute in a private room. Julian refused. He demanded that the hotel prove in front of the remaining guests that he had not been lying. His alpha pride was on the line, and he couldn't bear the thought of his clients seeing him humiliated. He couldn't stand the idea of an Omega, me, having power over him. As the primary account holder, I authorized the hotel to display only records connected to Julian's own authorization and the charges he had personally signed. The original account request appeared on the screen. Applicant, Sebastian Ashworth, Omega. Authorized user, Julian Cross, Alpha. The courier receipt showed that the package had been accepted at Julian's office by Evan Marchetti. Private client services also retained an electronic copy of the original letter. It clearly described the card as an additional authorization on a private account. It said all signed expenses would be sent to the sponsor. Evan had never given Julian that letter. The general manager then displayed 3 years of settlement summaries. Proposal dinners, client suites, receptions, corporate meetings. Every charge signed by Julian had ultimately been transferred to my private account. My name appeared on every transaction, the Omega sponsor behind the Alpha's success. The records also included the 3 nights in the honeymoon suite at the Meridian, New York, the anniversary celebration, the champagne, the spa treatments. The room became silent. Guests who had admired Evan's supposed connections only minutes earlier turned toward him. One of his bridesmaids spoke first. You always said your uncle managed Meridian's private clients. Evan's lips went white. His omega scent curdled with panic. Julian grabbed his arm. You told me you used your family connection to get this card. You told me you had an uncle. Evan pulled away. I was the one who handed it to you. I was the one who made every hotel arrangement. Every time I called, they did what I asked. How was I supposed to know? How were you supposed to know what? Julian's voice was shaking now. That he was paying? That all of this? He gestured wildly at the room, at the flowers, the wine, the guests, the entire catastrophe of the evening. Was built on money you didn't have, connections you didn't have, lies you kept feeding me so you could. So I could what? Evan's fear had curdled into fury. So I could be with you? So I could help you? You wanted this, Julian. You signed every agreement. You made the choices. You wanted the clients to think you could afford it just as much as I did. You're an alpha. You couldn't stand anyone thinking you weren't successful. I signed because you told me your uncle. My uncle doesn't exist. The words hung in the air. Julian's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, then a kind of dawning horror. What do you mean, he doesn't exist? I mean there's no uncle in Meridian's private client division. I made him up. The card arrived at the office. I opened the package. I saw the letter, and I saw an opportunity. Evan's voice was brittle, almost triumphant in its honesty. I told you I had connections because I knew you'd believe me. Because you wanted to believe me. Because it was easier to believe an Omega employee had influence than to question the foundation of everything you'd built. You needed to believe I was special. You needed to believe you'd upgraded. Julian's hand tightened on the counter, his knuckles white. You ruined my marriage. I ruined your marriage. Evan laughed, but there was no joy in it. You chose to cheat on Sebastian. You chose to leave him. You chose to believe the lies because they were convenient. You thought he was just some boring Omega who didn't understand you. You thought I was better because I told you what you wanted to hear. The banquet manager placed the supplements across the counter. $17,000 for the suspended garden, signed by Julian Cross. $23,000 for $100 for the cellar wine upgrade, signed by Julian Cross. The extra tables, 16 guest rooms, rooftop lounge, late-night catering, and security all listed clearly. All confirmed with his signature. The manager spoke in an even tone. Whether the founder's legacy account card is active does not change Mr. Cross's responsibility as the event contract holder. Meridian never promised a free event or an internal discount. One of Julian's long-term clients asked quietly, "Did your funding actually close?" Julian didn't answer. His business partner, standing nearby, looked increasingly alarmed. He hadn't known Julian was publicly speaking as though a financing transaction still under negotiation had already been completed. His alpha scent had gone sour with anxiety. Evan saw the partner's face. The funding never closed, did it? Julian glared at him. Stop talking. The office is rented. The car is rented too, isn't it? The suits. I said stop. What about the ring? Is that financed as well? Julian said nothing. Evan laughed again. You married me because you thought I had access to hotels and investors. You married me because you thought I could make you look bigger than you actually are. You married me because you wanted an Omega who could open doors for you. And did you marry me because you loved me? Julian's voice was cold now, defensive. Or because you thought I was already rich? At least I didn't use money my ex-husband was paying and call it my own success. At least I didn't steal someone else's card and pretend it was my family connection. At least I'm not an alpha who needed an Omega to prop him up. You used it too. You used it for 3 years. You used it and never once asked why it worked. Because you love the lie too much. Evan pointed at the platinum card in Julian's hand. You wanted to believe I had influence because it made you feel important. It made you feel like you deserved special treatment. You didn't want to know the truth because the truth would have made you look small. That was the sentence that broke Julian. He knocked a champagne glass from the counter. It shattered against the floor. Guests stepped back. Some lowered their phones. Others raised them higher, capturing every moment of the disaster unfolding in front of them. The alpha's reputation, his pride, his carefully constructed image, all of it crumbling in front of the people he most wanted to impress. The pair who had exchanged vows less than an hour before began arguing about who was responsible for every bottle of wine, every flower, every hotel room. The wedding meant to prove their success became a public audit of everything they did not own. 2 omegas and an alpha, all of them exposed. Julian looked around at his clients, his relatives, the hotel employees, his business partner. His face burned red. His alpha scent was thick with humiliation and rage, the kind that made other alphas instinctively wary. Then he turned to me. For the first time that night, his voice softened. Sebastian. I looked at him. Restore the authorization. He was almost pleading now. Just for tonight. I'll repay you. I promise. I'll sign whatever you want. Just, please. Restored under what relationship? His mouth opened. No answer came. We were married for 6 years, I said. And during those 6 years, I paid expenses and protected your dignity, because you were my husband. Because I loved you. I gave you everything I had, and you didn't even bother to ask where it came from. I looked at the card. We've been divorced for 4 months. I'm no longer your omega. You knew we were getting married here, he said desperately. You should have warned me that the card no longer worked. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. I hadn't. He was standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of his choices, and he genuinely believed that I had owed him a warning, that my silence was a betrayal, that I had somehow trapped him, tricked him, humiliated him on purpose. He couldn't conceive that I simply hadn't been thinking about him at all. I canceled the authorization the morning after our divorce became final, I said slowly. You carried a private additional card you hadn't used for 4 months into my family's hotel to marry the omega who helped destroy our marriage. And you believe I had a duty to warn you that I wouldn't keep paying? His face shifted between anger and humiliation. I didn't know Meridian was connected to you. I told you my family invested in hotels. You never said Meridian. Because every time I tried to explain, you informed me that my family couldn't possibly operate at this level. You were too busy protecting your own ego to listen. You didn't want to hear about my work, my family, my world. You just wanted me to be quiet and supportive. He fell silent. While we were dating, Julian had said he didn't care about my background. After we married, he treated his ignorance as proof that he was noble. Once his company began to grow, he preferred believing in an uncle Evan had invented over listening to the omega who had stood beside him for years. He had looked down on me because I was an omega, and he had never questioned that assumption. The truth hadn't been hidden as deeply as he wanted to believe. He had simply never considered me important enough to understand. I turned to the general manager. Proceed under the contract. Give them until tomorrow afternoon to arrange the funds. If legal approves it, the Ashworth family account will not accept any part of this charge. Then I turned to leave. Julian followed 2 steps. Does watching this happen to me make you happy? I stopped. No. I looked back at him. I'm simply no longer cleaning up your disasters. I'm no longer your omega. I'm no longer your anything. That night, Julian paid part of the bill with personal credit cards and called his mother for a loan. Meridian's legal department agreed to convert the remaining balance into a short-term payment agreement, but required his vehicle and company receivables as security. Only then did Evan learn how fragile Julian's business really was. The funding he'd claimed had closed was only a non-binding expression of interest. The office, luxury vehicle, and much of his expensive image were rentals, leases, or installment plans designed to impress clients. The alpha he'd married was a house of cards. Julian finally learned that Evan had no relatives in hotel management. Most of the investor network he'd claimed as his own came from customer contact lists and names he'd collected at public events. He'd never had the connections he'd pretended to have. He'd just been very good at making people think he did. He was an omega who had built his entire identity on a lie. Evan didn't go home with him. Still wearing his wedding suit, he left in his parents' car. Before he drove away, he removed his ring and placed it on the stone edge of the hotel's fountain. The gesture was dramatic, theatrical, very Evan, and it was captured by at least 3 phones. The photo would go viral within hours. The gold collar around his throat, the symbol of his high-status marriage, suddenly seemed like a mockery. 6 weeks later, he filed for divorce. His attorney accused Julian of making material misrepresentations about his financial condition. Julian accused Evan of inventing family influence and using those lies to affect both his marriage and his business decisions. 2 omegas and an alpha, all of them in ruins. Neither of them wanted to mention me in public. To mention me was to admit that the wealth, influence, and status they'd celebrated were built on years of my silence and support. That everything they thought they'd built was, in fact, built by the omega they'd discarded. It would be too humiliating. The video from the billing desk still spread online. The first major damage was not to their new marriage. It was to Julian's company. Several clients reopened their contract reviews. The business partner who'd heard Julian imply that the financing had closed demanded complete access to the firm's true cash position. 2 projects were paused. A senior employee resigned. Julian had spent years turning expensive locations, leased cars, and special treatment into proof of credibility. Once people learned that much of that treatment had come through his ex-Omega husband's private account, the image stopped functioning as trust. The foundation crumbled, and everything built on top of it crumbled too. 2 months later, he came to Meridian headquarters to see me. He wasn't wearing one of the custom suits he'd once loved. He had on an ordinary shirt, and he looked as though he'd aged several years since the wedding. His alpha scent was muted, almost beta-like, the sharp edges worn down by humiliation and fear. He looked like a man who had lost everything and didn't know how to get it back. He said the company was running out of cash. Partners wanted early payment. The bank had reduced his credit line. He wanted me to make a public statement that the incident at the wedding had been caused by a technical problem in the hotel account system. He wanted me to lie, to cover for him, to protect his reputation one more time. He wanted his Omega ex-husband to save him. 1 sentence from you, he said, and the clients will stop questioning me. I set down the document I was reading. It wasn't a technical problem. Sebastian, we were married for 6 years. Exactly. That's why I know you're not asking for the truth. You're asking for another person to absorb the consequences for you. You're asking the Omega you discarded to save you. His voice dropped. I honestly didn't know those resources came from you. You had chances to know. I met his eyes. I told you my family invested in hotels. I offered to help you secure the Meridian rooms. I asked you, multiple times, to read the original letter that came with the card. But you didn't want to believe an Omega could be capable of helping you. In the story you told about yourself, I had to be ordinary so your success could belong entirely to you. He was silent for a long time. I could see him struggling with something. The realization, perhaps, of how deeply he had failed to see me. How thoroughly he had dismissed me because of my secondary gender. At the door, he asked one final question. If Evan hadn't taken the letter, would we have been different? I shook my head. The card exposed his lie. It didn't create your choices. You chose not to listen when I spoke. You chose to treat support as your own achievement. You chose to betray me. And then you chose to belittle me to justify it. Without that card, you would have found something else that allowed you to believe you deserved everything and owed gratitude to no one. You would have found another reason to look down on me. Because I was an Omega, and you didn't think Omegas could be your equals. After the door closed, I asked my assistant to continue the presentation for Meridian's next quarter brand plan. We were preparing to open a new property on the West Coast, and the group-wide brand modernization project I led was entering its final stage. For years, I had made my own world smaller to protect my marriage. I thought that refusing credit, avoiding attention, and keeping quiet would earn respect. I thought that as an Omega, I had to prove I wasn't demanding, wasn't difficult, wasn't the stereotype. I finally understood that someone who respects you doesn't need to know your net worth before treating you well. Someone who loves you doesn't treat your silence as permission to keep taking. The founder's legacy account card had never erased a bill. It had only hidden the person paying it. I had once been willing to stay behind the scenes because Julian was my husband. When the marriage ended, I didn't take away a privilege that belonged to him. I ended my obligation to pay for the consequences of his life. I gave him access, and he called it success. Evan stole the credit, and Julian called it love. In the end, an inactive card was not what destroyed their wedding. The wedding fell apart because once no one else agreed to pay, they finally discovered they had fallen in love with nothing but the value each of them had pretended to possess. I thought about Julian sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and the hotel was still, and I could hear the hum of the heating system through the walls. I thought about the early days, when he'd been hungry and ambitious and full of fire. I thought about the way he'd looked at me like I was the most important thing in his world. I thought about the temporary marking bite he'd placed on my neck, and how I'd believed it meant forever. I thought about how that look had faded, how that bite had faded, how he'd stopped seeing me as anything but an accessory. And then I let it go. Because the truth was, Julian Cross had never loved me. He'd loved what I represented. He'd loved the idea of an Omega who would support him without demanding credit, who would stay in the background while he shone, who would quietly make his life easier without asking for anything in return. He'd loved the stereotype of the perfect Omega, and I had fit it well enough until I no longer served his ego. Evan Marchetti had offered him the same thing, but with better packaging. More ambition, more charm, more willingness to lie. They deserved each other. They destroyed each other. And I was no longer part of that equation. The brand committee meeting ran long. By the time I finished, the Chicago night had settled in fully, the city lights glittering through the windows of the conference room. I gathered my materials, said goodnight to my colleagues, and walked back to the elevator. The lobby was quiet now. The last guests had retired to their rooms. The ballroom, which had been the site of so much drama, was dark, the furniture rearranged for tomorrow's corporate breakfast. The floral installation had been taken down days ago. The scent of champagne had faded. I walked past the billing counter, still a little surprised to see how normal it looked. The same marble, the same terminals, the same clerks, who glanced up as I passed and nodded with professional courtesy. No one mentioned the wedding. No one mentioned Julian or Evan or the invoice that had nearly destroyed two people's lives. It was just another day at the Meridian Grand Chicago. I stepped out onto the street and inhaled the cold Chicago air. My driver was waiting, the car warm and ready. I slid into the back seat and closed my eyes, letting the city hum around me. Tomorrow, there would be more meetings, more decisions, more work to do. But tonight, there was just this, the quiet of the city, the hum of the car, the distant echo of a door closing on a chapter of my life I'd finally, truly left behind. The platinum card was gone. Julian was gone. Evan was gone. The temporary marking bite was long healed. I was an Omega who had built her own world, on her own terms. And I was free.